There is a crisis spreading through the most connected society in human history. Not a crisis of poverty or war or disease, though it carries the mortality risk of all three. It is a crisis of inner absence. And the people suffering most are not the ones who are alone. They are the ones who have never learned to be with themselves. This is sovereign psychology, a structural solution to loneliness. According to the American Psychological Association, the United States is experiencing what researchers are now calling a loneliness epidemic. Not a trend, not a phase, an epidemic with measurable consequences to mental health, physical health, and lifespan. 58% of Americans report feeling lonely often or always. Social isolation is now associated with a 29% increase in the risk of heart disease, a 32% increase in the risk of stroke, and mortality rates comparable to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. The Surgeon General has issued formal advisories on it. Governments are appointing ministers of loneliness to address it. And yet, for all the data, all the papers, and all the proposed solutions, something is missing from the conversation. Because the dominant response to loneliness is this: connect more, join a group, call a neighbor, attend a class, find community. And for many people, those suggestions help, temporarily. But the question no one seems to be asking is this: why do some people feel profound loneliness even when surrounded by others, while others feel none at all, even in extended, deliberate solitude? That question points to something deeper than the absence of social contact. It points to architecture, specifically the architecture of the mind itself. That is what this video is about. The 5 solutions the APA most commonly proposes are these: increase face-to-face contact, strengthen community ties, address social barriers, prioritize relationships in policy, use technology to connect rather than isolate. These are not wrong, but they share a common assumption: that loneliness is a supply problem, that if you add enough human contact, the deficit disappears. What this framework cannot explain is the person who has a full social life and still feels profoundly alone. It cannot explain the individual who spends weeks or months in solitude and reports not just the absence of loneliness, but a deepening sense of clarity, peace, and self-possession. The difference between those two people is not the quantity of their relationships. It is the source of their psychological stability. One person is what systems researchers would call an open-loop system. Their emotional state is set from the outside. They require external input, validation, and proximity to regulate themselves. When that input disappears, the system destabilizes. The other person operates as a closed-loop system. They generate their own psychological stability from the inside. External connection enhances their life, but it does not constitute it. The open-loop person does not suffer from loneliness because they are deficient. They suffer because they were never taught that an alternative architecture exists and that it can be built deliberately. That is the conversation we are having today. To understand why this matters, we need to understand what is happening in the brain during loneliness. Loneliness is not simply the feeling of being alone. Neuroscientifically, it is a threat response. Research by social neuroscientist John Cacioppo at the University of Chicago established that the lonely brain processes social absence as a survival threat. The amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, becomes hyperactivated. The default mode network, which governs self-referential thought, shifts toward threat scanning. The body begins producing cortisol, the stress hormone, at elevated levels. The immune system responds as if to physical danger. This is not metaphorical. Loneliness places the body under genuine physiological stress. Now here is where it gets important. Stephen Porges' Polyvagal Theory tells us that the human nervous system is constantly scanning the environment for what he calls neuroception, the unconscious assessment of safety or danger. For most people, the primary signal of safety is proximity to other people. The nervous system was calibrated across evolutionary time to treat solitude as dangerous. To be separated from the group was, for most of human history, to be exposed to predators, starvation, and death. So the brain developed a mechanism, social hunger. When you are alone too long, the system generates distress signals designed to push you back toward the group. This is not a flaw. It is ancient biological engineering. But here is the critical insight. The nervous system is not reading reality. It is reading signals, and signals can be recalibrated. Self-determination theory, developed by psychologists Edward Deci and Richard Ryan, identifies 3 core psychological needs: autonomy, competence, and relatedness. The conventional response to loneliness focuses almost exclusively on relatedness, that is, social connection. But when autonomy and competence are sufficiently developed, they can become the primary source of psychological well-being. The need for constant relatedness does not disappear, but its urgency drops dramatically. In other words, if you develop strong enough internal governance, the nervous system stops reading solitude as a threat. It reads it as signal silence, a state that actually allows for higher fidelity internal processing. This is not theoretical. It is documented, trainable, and available to anyone willing to build it. What follows are 3 fundamental shifts that separate a person who suffers loneliness from one who does not. Each one has a psychological mechanism, a neurobiological basis, and a practical point of application. Shift 1, from co-regulation to self-regulation. Most people regulate their emotional and physiological state through other people. This is called co-regulation, and it is the default setting of the human nervous system. When you are anxious, you call someone. When you are grieving, you seek proximity. When you are uncertain, you look for validation. This is not weakness. It is how the nervous system was designed to function in community. But there is another mode. It is called self-regulation, and it operates through the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for executive function, planning, and the conscious modulation of emotional response. Research in effective neuroscience is clear. The prefrontal cortex can be developed. Repeated engagement of top-down emotional regulation, choosing a considered response over an automatic reaction, literally strengthens the neural pathways involved. Over time, through a process called myelination, those pathways become faster, more efficient, and less metabolically costly. What feels like enormous willpower at first becomes, eventually, the default setting of the system. The practical implication is this: self-regulation is not an inborn trait. It is a skill, and it is built the same way any skill is built, through deliberate, repeated practice under conditions of discomfort. Shift 2, from identity as a social construct to identity as an internal structure. Psychologist Murray Bowen introduced the concept of differentiation of self. In Bowen's framework, most people exist on a spectrum between emotional fusion and differentiation. At the low end of differentiation, a person's emotional temperature is set almost entirely by those around them. If the group is anxious, they are anxious. If they are alone, they lose their sense of who they are. They are, in a real psychological sense, homeless inside themselves. At the high end of differentiation, a person can be deeply connected to others while remaining a distinct, autonomous entity. They do not require external validation to know who they are. Their identity is not a mirror image of those around them. It is a structure they inhabit from the inside. This distinction is foundational to why some people suffer loneliness and others do not. It is not that the differentiated person needs less connection. It is that their sense of self does not collapse in its absence. The practical entry point for building this is what researchers call identity-based behavior change. The psychologist James Clear, building on earlier identity theory research, articulated this distinction clearly. Outcome-based change relies on willpower. Identity-based change relies on the prior decision about who you are. When you decide, before the moment of difficulty, that you are the kind of person who does not require external input to remain stable, the behavioral change follows from identity rather than from effort. It is structurally more durable. Shift 3, from reactive to responsive. Neuroscience identifies a gap between stimulus and response. In a reactive system, that gap is near zero. The stimulus arrives, and the behavior follows automatically. The amygdala fires, the behavior matches the emotional signal, and the prefrontal cortex plays catch up after the fact. In a responsive system, the gap is consciously held open. The stimulus arrives. There is awareness of it. There is a moment of evaluation. Is this signal true, or is it a conditioned pattern? And then there is a deliberate choice about how to proceed. This is what some psychologists call metacognitive regulation, the ability to observe your own mental processes and intervene in them before they produce behavior. Research by Antoine Lutz and colleagues at the University of Wisconsin found that experienced meditators showed significantly greater activation of the prefrontal cortex and reduced amygdala reactivity during emotionally charged stimuli, compared to non-meditators. The mechanism is not mystical. It is structural. The repeated practice of observing a mental event without immediately acting on it strengthens the neural circuitry that makes that gap possible. The practical implication is direct. Any moment of discomfort, including the discomfort of solitude, is a moment of practice. The person who can sit with the ache of missing someone, not to suppress it but to observe it without being commanded by it, is building the neural architecture of sovereignty. Let us be precise about what is happening when a person moves from an open loop to a closed loop system. At the neural level, what changes is the ratio of limbic reactivity to prefrontal governance. The limbic system, particularly the amygdala and the structures associated with social threat monitoring, does not disappear. It continues to generate signals. What changes is the degree to which those signals automatically translate into behavior. Think of it this way. The limbic system is a sensor array. It is extraordinarily sensitive and has been tuned over millions of years to detect threats, including social threats. You do not want to disable it. You want to govern it. Governance means this: the signal arrives, it is acknowledged, and then it is evaluated by a higher order process before it determines behavior. Over time, as this pattern is repeated, the evaluation process becomes faster, cheaper, and more automatic. What required intense conscious effort at first becomes, through myelination, a subroutine. You are not fighting your nervous system anymore. You have upgraded it. This is what psychological literature refers to when it uses the phrase earned security. It is a demonstrable shift in the operating architecture of the self. But there is one more piece, and it is perhaps the most important. The person who has built internal governance does not become cold or detached. They become, paradoxically, more capable of deep connection. Because they are not coming to relationships in a state of deficit, they are not extracting from them. They are contributing to them. The relationship is not a life preserver. It is an exchange between two complete entities. This is the final dimension of what we might call sovereign psychology. Not independence from others, not isolation as a value, but the capacity to be alone without suffering, which makes you capable of being with others without clinging. This is not an instruction to go live alone on a road for months. The principles here apply in any life, in any occupation, in any circumstance. Here is how you begin. First, audit your current regulation strategy. Ask yourself honestly, when I am uncomfortable, where do I go first? Do I reach for a person, a device, a distraction? Or do I sit with the signal long enough to understand what it is actually telling me? There is no judgment in this audit. It is simply a diagnosis. Second, begin practicing the gap. When discomfort arises, physical, emotional, or social, practice holding it for 10 seconds before responding. Not suppressing it, holding it. Observe the sensation. Name it if you can. Let it exist without immediately acting on it. This simple practice, done consistently, begins to develop the prefrontal musculature required for self-regulation. Third, make an identity decision before the next moment of difficulty. Not, I will try not to feel lonely today, but I am a person who can be with my own experience without requiring it to be immediately resolved. That is a different category of statement. It is a constitutional claim, not a behavioral intention. Fourth, understand that the body has its own timeline. Cognitive understanding arrives before somatic integration. You may understand something intellectually while your nervous system still runs the old program. This is not failure. It is the lag time built into biological systems. Your nervous system is conservative by design. It requires repeated new evidence before it updates its priors. Provide that evidence through consistent behavior, not through further analysis. And fifth, do not confuse solitude with loneliness. They are not the same state. Solitude is being alone in the presence of yourself. Loneliness is being alone in the absence of yourself. One is a resource, the other is a symptom. What we are building here is the internal presence that makes solitude a resource. The APA's data tells us there is a crisis, and there is. But the crisis is not that people are spending too much time without other people. The crisis is that most people have never been given the internal infrastructure to be present with themselves. They are, in a real sense, strangers in their own minds. And when the external scaffolding of social life fails them, as it inevitably does at points across any life, there is nothing left to stand on. What we have described in this video is not a rejection of community or connection. It is the prerequisite for genuine community. You cannot give what you do not have. You cannot be fully present with another person if your own inner kingdom is not in order. The person who has built sovereign psychology does not need less from others. They need something different. They need exchange, not supply. Resonance, not rescue. The work is internal. The result is visible in everything. If you are someone who has felt that loneliness in the data is simply your experience, that there is something missing in your life that others seem to have, I want to leave you with this thought. What is missing may not be more people. It may be your own presence to yourself. And that is something you can cultivate regardless of your circumstances, regardless of your occupation, regardless of where you are in life right now. The power to rule oneself and experience internal self-sovereignty is not elsewhere. It was always yours to claim.